Hello everyone, Julian Charles here of themindrenewed.com, coming to you at, well, I would usually say as usual, but I won't do this time after our long Christmas break that we just had, but almost as usual, from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. And of course the reason why The Mind Renewed has been off air for somewhat longer than I would have liked is due, of course, to my persistent voice problem, which seems to be getting better. And I don't know if that's definite, but the trajectory certainly seems to be upward, and it's good to be able to be behind the microphone again and start speaking. And let me just say thanks to the very many of you who have sent messages of concern and offered to pray for me. I very much appreciate that. So thanks to all of you who've done that. So now, today, to kick off 2015 here at The Mind Renewed a little bit later than anticipated, I'm delighted to welcome back to the programme our friend Antony Rotunno, who joined us last year to talk about changing the discourse, as we called that conversation. And I'll just say quickly, for those who may not have caught that previous conversation, Antony is a teacher, blogger and freethinker, originally from the UK, but who now lives and works in Spain, in Madrid. So Antony, welcome again. It's good to have you on to kick off 2015.
Hi Julian, how are you? Happy New Year.
And Happy New Year to you. As I say, I'm okay. It's not completely gone yet, but I'm hoping this medication is working. Medication always sounds bad, doesn't it? But,
Well, I did enjoy your husky introduction to the Norman Dodd interview, I must say.
Oh, thank you very much.
And it took me a while to remember, actually, you had voice problems. I suddenly thought, is he using a new approach? It sounded quite mysterious, and it worked, actually, strangely enough.
Oh, right.
You should have done more like that.
I might do, but then, of course, it wouldn't be genuine next time
That's
around. Or maybe
right.
it would be. I mean, maybe the problem's going to come back with a vengeance, but I do hope not.
Yeah, it's never the same if you contrive it, is it?
No,
It's
absolutely.
always better by accident.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, of course, a bit like last time, I think the idea that we've agreed is that we're going to be having more of a conversation, aren't we, than an interview. And I'm hoping that that's going to be slightly lighter in weight than some of the interviews we have here on The Mind Renewed.
Yeah.
All right, it's not going to be trivial, I hope, but because of the subject matter, I think it's going to be a recipe of, let's say, seriousness seasoned with a little mirth, would you say?
Oh, yeah. Comedy and profundity in equal measure.
That's it. Right, so 'cause we've decided to call it, was it truth comedy?
Truth comedy, yes.
Yeah, let's call it that. And I've just jotted down a kind of definition of that to sort of guide us, and I'm saying that that's the ways in which the art of comedy can help to alert people to the truth of what's going on in our world, that is to sort of help break through the propaganda matrix that we find ourselves in, but also the ways in which comedy, as again, the art of comedy, can reveal and help to free us from ways of thinking that can sometimes inhibit critical thought in various ways. So a massive subject, potentially massive, and we can't do justice to it, but we've decided, haven't we, to approach this by way of examples. And we're going to start with the BBC situation comedy from the 1980s, which was first of all Yes Minister and then became Yes Prime Minister. And this is the subject of your latest blog post, which I'm going to say to everybody, it's well worth reading, actually. It's a massive blog post. I mean, it must have taken you ages to do. I don't know whether everybody knows this series. I mean, people in the UK will know it really, really well, but I don't know, to the rest of the world, to what extent it's known. So could you give us a kind of introduction to it and then tell us why you think this is such a significant series?
Yeah, well, it was, as you said, it's a BBC series that came out, as you said, in the 1980s. Essentially, it's the battle between a politician who's, first of all, a government minister, which I think in America would be a senator, probably, or a congressman, something like that. And then he becomes prime minister. It's basically, on one hand, you've got the minister whose name is Jim Hacker, and I'll come back to that name, so try and remember that one, Jim Hacker. He's basically the minister for a particular department of the government, and his nemesis is a top civil servant who's Sir Humphrey Appleby. And the civil service is basically a permanent bureaucracy, and their official duty is to implement government decisions. So on the surface, the minister comes up with a policy, and then the civil service implement that policy, the administration, etc. So they're supposedly doing what he wants, but of course the truth is nothing like that, because the civil service, it's called the safest job in England, because it's a job where a person is groomed through the service, and it's very difficult to lose that job as long as you don't upset the status quo too much. So essentially the civil servant, Sir Humphrey, is blocking Hacker at every turn. And Hacker's he starts out as an idealist, sort of a genuinely wanting to be a reformer. In fact, he's a former editor of a magazine called Reform, which we don't really know much about, but we presume that it's quite progressive. So essentially, the main three characters that you need to know about is Jim Hacker, who's the minister, Sir Humphrey Appleby, who's a top civil servant, and then you've got a guy called Bernard Woolley, who's stuck in the middle because he's Jim Hacker's private secretary, so he answers to him technically, but he's also in the civil service, and a lot of his career depends on Sir Humphrey. So, I mean, it's a great premise. It's a brilliant sort of triangle to begin with. The reason I think it's so good, and I mean, having rewatched it again, I mean, I'm absolutely blown away by how good it was. And in fact, I call my blog post "The Miracle of Yes Minister," and that's for two reasons. One of them, I just thought it was so good because it's comedy with amazing scripts and amazing performances, and all it is basically middle-aged men talking about politics. There's no sex in it. Okay. The only action is Sir Humphrey, the civil servant, rushing into a room to sort of stop Jim Hacker going on TV and making a huge gaffe. You know, that's the only action in it. So
there's another middle-aged man, isn't there? There's Sir Arnold Robinson, is he the cabinet secretary? Is that right?
Yeah, just briefly, the cabinet secretary is basically the civil servant to the prime minister. He does the same duty to the prime minister. And without making it too complicated, when Hacker becomes the prime minister, Sir Humphrey becomes the cabinet secretary. So essentially the dynamic doesn't change. But Sir Arnold is an even more sort of jaded and cynical civil servant who advises Sir Humphrey. And I mean, they're absolute masters at stopping progress, you know, and they continually say it. They don't hide it. They say, yes, ministers it's a problem. Politicians, they've started doing things. And at one point they say, there's actually a politician with two ideas, which is highly dangerous. You know, one idea is fine, but two ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the conversations that they have with each other, you know, they're priceless, aren't they, those conversations? They're so revealing of a certain kind of attitude. And there was one conversation they had, this was in the Christmas episode, which was the transition between Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, where Hacker is tipped to become Prime Minister, and they're actually discussing amongst themselves what kind of person would fit the bill of Prime Minister. And it's a fantastic sort of Gilbertian kind of conversation they have, where the dialogue is actually distributed between the two of them. So they say, one says one word and the other says the other word. It's incredible. And I've got it written down here, and they're discussing this, what candidate they want. And a compromise candidate, malleable, flexible, likeable, no firm opinions, no big ideas, not intellectually committed, without the strength of purpose to change anything, someone you know can be manipulated, professionally guided, and leave the business of government in the hands of experts. And then there's a silence, and then they both laugh because they're both thinking of Jim Hacker. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful moment full of truths there.
I think it would be a bit too much to go into all the other stuff that happens, but basically the front runners for the Prime Minister, who's suddenly retired, are the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary, which is two of the top positions. But the problem with those two, according to the civil servants, is that they're both progressives and with ideas. So again, it's very profound, as you said, because they want someone who's controllable, and the way that they get the two front runners out the way is by opening their MI5 files.
Absolutely. I thought that was really priceless. Have you had a chance to glance at their MI5 files? No. Oh, you should always send for a cabinet minister's MI5 files if you enjoy a good laugh. And I immediately thought of what Annie Machon said about the situation where, you know, I think she was talking about Tony Blair or something in the particular thing that I heard, and she was saying, oh yeah, of course, there's an MI5 file on all these people, so you know, you don't know to what extent they're blackmailed in all kinds of ways, to what extent they're controlled through this mechanism. And there it was back in the 1980s, being told to everybody, you know, through this comedy.
Exactly.
It was remarkable, really.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, I mean, when these people get to top positions, you know, what's made available to them, you know? Presumably, when you're in a position of power, you know, the world's your oyster. You can have any indulgence you want, and then immediately they've got something on you. I'm pretty sure that's how it works, frankly.
I mean, it's similar, of course, in the States. I mean, Russ Tice has often said things like this, hasn't he, where, you know, the intelligence agencies over there have got all kinds of info on all kinds of politicians, and, you know, they're being leveraged in all kinds of ways all the time.
Every man has a weakness, you know.
And the information is known more than it ever has been because everybody's snooped on.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for your American listeners, MI5 is the equivalent of the FBI, and MI6 would be the CIA, so MI5 is the National Intelligence Service. Yeah, do you want me to go through some of the themes? I'll try and make it brief because we've got so much else to talk about.
Do, yeah, sure.
The bottom line is that government is cutthroat and cynical and career-driven. I don't doubt that at a local level, people who get into politics, there are true idealists who just want to help and who are not well paid and do work hard and everything. But at a certain point, I think people have got to accept that someone who gets a certain way through the system knows what's going on, you know. And
well, it's true of Hacker, isn't it? Because, as you said, he started off as an idealist, and you actually see him in the program acting like he wants to be an idealist most of the time.
Yes.
And yet there's certainly in that, I keep coming back to that particular episode because I think it was so brilliant, that transitional one between the two series, where it's so obvious there that he becomes a little civil servant. He becomes an Appleby because he's extorted into the situation because of these MI5 files and having to get these other candidates out of the way. He's extorted into the situation where he has to be like Appleby, and he has no choice. It's like a chess game, and he's now a pawn, and he knows it, but he actually acts in the same kind of way. And I thought it was quite revealing, actually. So here is an idealist who has the idealism knocked out of him, and there's nothing he can do about it.
Yes. Yeah, well, the writers described him as a mouse who learns how to be a rat, which I thought was brilliant. Yeah, and I mean, you're right. I mean, this show just perfectly shows the trajectory of someone's career. You know, he starts off pretty naive, pretty idealistic, and I think with a genuine conscience. And I think he manages to keep that conscience through the series. But you just realise through necessity he has to toughen up, and he has to become slightly Machiavellian, which is what you're saying, really, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. He becomes part of the machine, and nothing you can do about it,
So I think people like Sir Humphrey and Sir Arnold, you know, they're quite dark people, frankly, and, you know, part of that is probably just conditioning. But the other point of many points, all the scenes were shot in sort of secret rooms. You never actually see the Houses of Parliament, and you never really see the public either. I mean, occasionally you see them. And the point was that that's where the decisions are taken. So really what happens in Parliament, you know, particularly Prime Minister's questions, and when you make speeches to the public, everything has already been worked out in advance. And another brilliant quote, Sir Humphrey says about Prime Ministers are like actors. They just have to look plausible, stay sober, and say the lines they're given. Which is brilliant. And another scene, Jim Hacker goes to a local farm, and again, it's all for publicity, and he's filmed arriving at the local farm, and he's carrying a rabbit or something while they're interviewing him, and he starts giving a speech, and he's giving a very sort of cliched speech, and then he starts mentioning architects, and then he suddenly realised that he's got the wrong speech, and it's a speech he gave to the Architectural Society the previous day. But of course, the big laugh comes when he gets the right speech. It's exactly the same. The words changed.
Doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah, and again, it's just a perfect example. It's funny and completely profound at the same time, because clearly, you know, I mean, you know, I listened to David Cameron for about 20 seconds the other day before I, you know, was reaching for the sick bag, just going on about, oh, this is freedom and democracy, and this is.
And you thought this is Jim Hacker.
It's Jim Hacker, yeah, with a speech probably written by Sir Humphrey, yeah.
Yes. I want to just come back to this business about decisions being made in camera, really, and all the outward expressions to the public, and this is all just show, really, on that level. There was a fantastic quote by Sir Humphrey Appleby. Of course, he was talking about British democracy, and he described it as a civilised, aristocratic government machine tempered by occasional general elections. And I just thought, in just one sentence there, that says an awful lot, doesn't it? That elections really are just throwing a little bit of the illusion of freedom to the small people, while the real decisions are made in these oak-lined rooms.
Absolutely.
And I was reminded when I heard that of the thing that Noam Chomsky often makes reference to, that Trilateral Commission report in 1975 called The Crisis of Democracy, on the governability of democracies, in which the problem there, the crisis of democracy, seems to be that, well, there's too much democracy. People are too engaged politically, and so, you know, from an elite perspective, it's difficult to govern people. There's just too much democracy, an excess of democracy, as they call it. And I thought, this is the same kind of attitude.
Yeah, I mean, there's another really good podcast by Stefan Molyneux, who's a Canadian philosopher. And I mean, I won't talk about it now, but perhaps we could put a link to that. And it's called The Truth About Voting. And it's so worth reading for anyone who's interested. I mean, he really nails it. But shall I move on? Bureaucracy, first of all. Hacker gets absolutely swamped in bureaucracy. The quote, he says, there's either so little information that you don't know the facts or so much that you can't find them. And he calls it Catch-22, and then Sir Humphrey calls it Catch-22 subparagraph A, which I thought was fantastic. One of the best lines. You know, and the DAA, there's also sort of nods to Orwell as well. I mean, Orwell's not mentioned in the show, but it's very Orwellian. And
well, the DAA itself, is it, with Department of Administrative Affairs?
Exactly. It's a whole department set up to administrate administrators. And Sir Humphrey says, it takes time to do things now, it's more expensive to do them cheaply, and it's more democratic to do them in secret.
Yes.
So, I think that just sums it up, really. But,
is it lost files are under consideration, is that right?
Oh, no, it's under consideration means we've lost the file, and under active consideration means we're trying to find it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, in some sense, bureaucracy is actually a tool of the system, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, certainly you see that with Hacker, where he's given all these papers that he has to deal with, and that actually prevents him from doing anything important. And that's quite consciously done, isn't it?
Yeah, and in that City Farm episode, actually, Sir Humphrey gets him to sign something just as he's leaving for a meeting, and Hacker says, do I have to do it now? And he says, well, you did promise, Minister. And he signs it, and it turns out that he's agreed to let some developers build some apartment blocks right next to the farm. And obviously he wasn't aware of it. He just signed it to get Sir Humphrey off his back. Because another thing Sir Humphrey does is, just as Hacker wants to leave, Sir Humphrey will just bamboozle him with words, what I call verbal bureaucracy, which is just, it's maddening him with so many words that he doesn't understand, because Sir Humphrey's sort of very verbally dexterous. That he just, in the end, he just signs because he's just beaten into submission. So
that's another interesting thing, that Sir Humphrey comes over as being this sort of super intellectual, but actually I'm not convinced that he is any brighter than Hacker. It's that he has this background, doesn't he? Been to Eton and Oxford, and sort of therefore has this confidence that he's secure in the system, and he's been brought up to believe that he's superior. Whereas Hacker, went to the LSE and studied economics or whatever, so he might be much more mathematically literate than Appleby. But that doesn't matter, because Hacker doesn't have that same sort of status and that class security that the other guy has, and I think that's played on a lot, isn't it? So that Hacker feels inferior, even though he actually probably isn't intellectually.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're saying is it comes down to appearance, and our society is basically 80-90% about appearance. Again, people don't look beyond what they see in front of them, basically.
There's a heck of a lot of bluff.
There is, yeah. Yeah, and the other thing was about the media, because there's a lot of scenes as well where they meet the media, and it's clear that there's collusion between not only the two parties, but them and the media as well. And a famous quote is where Jim Hacker's talking about the newspapers, because for overseas listeners, in England we have a lot of newspapers, and they're very ideologically driven. Hacker says, the Daily Mirror is read by people who think they run the country, the Guardian is read by people who think they ought to run the country, the Times is read by people who actually do run the country, the Daily Mail is read by the wives of the people that run the country, and the Financial Times is read by people who own the country. So really the point there is that we're just being given this deliberate sort of division, really, by the newspapers. Because if you read, for example, The Guardian, which is traditionally left-wing, and The Times or The Telegraph, which is nicknamed the Tory Graph, which is very conservative, you're going to get two very different spins on the same facts and the same information. I think I'll leave it there, shall I? Because I could go on for another hour, but...
Yeah, there's one thing, I think, before the interview we were saying about how remarkable it is that this was 30 years ago, and the warning was there, as it were. This was actually being brought out for people to understand, and people did. I mean, I remember people commenting about and saying, this is so true, we can see so much the reality of life in this, but it didn't lead anywhere. It just stayed as entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, we were saying, weren't we, it's this thing of... holding two opposing opinions at the same time, basically. We mentioned cognitive dissonance last time. It's a sort of form of that, where you can say, oh yeah, that's true, but then like another part of your mind, perhaps, or another part of your brain filters out the idea of actually being outraged about it.
And so the next general election comes around, and people go out and vote and think it actually really does matter, even though they've been watching this program and saying, "Oh, it's so true that these
Exactly.
things."
They have
It's
they have
curious.
instinct. Yeah, and comedy does bring out that instinct. I think when you laugh, a lot of the time you're laughing because something is true. You're not only laughing because the joke is funny. There was one other thing, tiny thing. Nigel Hawthorne, who played Sir Humphrey, was a fantastic actor, and he won lots
Brilliant.
of awards.
Yeah.
But what's very interesting is that in the very rare moments when Sir Humphrey Appleby makes a mistake, Nigel Hawthorne does this incredible face where Sir Humphrey suddenly regresses to looking like a child.
That's very
basically.
true. Yes.
And what I thought was very interesting is the idea of standing up to fear. If you think of it as sort of a cliched, sort of scary boss in the office, I used to have one of those scary bosses. And I used to go to work terribly intimidated. I worked in an office, it was a good few years ago. And I remember I read something or I watched something, and they were saying, behind every scary boss is basically sort of inadequacy, or there's some need to exert power on other people. And if you stand up to them, you'll be amazed how quickly they crumble. And I tried it, and it sort of turned out to be true. It's the bully thing, isn't it, really? You stand up to the bully, and you'll be amazed how quickly they crumble. And a lot of people get their power from the power you give them. And that's true of governments, that's true of bosses, that's true of, whoever. And, yeah, there's the scene from A Bug's Life. The grasshoppers, they go every year to steal the ants' food. And one of the grasshoppers says, well, we've actually got enough food. Why do we need to steal from the ants? And he says, it's not that we need the food. It's that we realize if we don't steal their food, they might realize that they outnumber us, 200,000 to 1. They might realize their power. That's quite a sort of theme in the alternative movement, is realize your power, We've got the 99%, which, in my opinion, is more like the 99.9% against, the 0.1%, which is really the legacy of the Occupy movement. If they did nothing else, they'd put the idea of the super rich and everyone else rather than these left and right, sort of contrived divisions. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to Being There, which was one of the things that I decided to talk about. And again, I'm not sure whether this is hugely well known. So what I'm going to do is just to give a brief introduction to it. So this is a film from the 1970s, 1979, starred Peter Sellers, and I consider it to be a kind of allegory, a cinematic allegory for the way that politicians are essentially puppets in the hands of power, controlling corporate power, products of the media. Mm-hmm. So it was written by a Polish-American novelist called Jfk Kosinski, wrote a book by the same title, 1971. Now, according to the BBC dramatisation of Peter Sellers' life, Peter Sellers was absolutely desperate to do this film and play the main protagonist, Chauncey Gardner, and it turned out to be the last film that Peter Sellers did that was released in his lifetime. So Peter Sellers plays the part of this man called Chance, who I guess is sort of 50-ish, something like that. He's simple-minded. He lives in a really quite well-appointed old house in Washington, D.C. He lives with this elderly man. We don't really know why he's living there. You can speculate that perhaps he was an orphan and was taken in perhaps by the elderly man's wife or something like that, or perhaps he's a child of a relative. We're just not told. Anyway, he's there. Being there, he's just there. And he spent his whole life looking after this garden of the house, and it's a walled garden, so you couldn't see the outside world, and watching TV. And he seems to get all his information about the world just through watching TV. And the old man has put all these TVs in virtually every room in the house. Anyway, the old man dies, and because this Chance character has no nous, as we say in this area of the northwest of England, he's persuaded by lawyers to make no claim to the estate, and he's told that he has to leave, so he ventures out, you see, into the world for the first time. And I found it a really weird experience watching this for the first time, because you start watching it and you think that it's a really sad movie. This guy does nothing. He's just lying in bed and he's just watching TV in an aimless way, and he's flicking from channel to channel. And you think the whole film is going to be sort of a study in depression and loneliness or something like that. And it's only gradually, as you keep watching, that you step by step realise that this is a comedy, a kind of comedy in slow motion. I think that's a remarkable achievement, actually. Anyway, he's out and about in the world, and he accidentally is nudged by the limousine that belongs to the wife of Benjamin Rand, a super rich businessman. Of course, that connotes the Rand Corporation there. So Benjamin Rand, that's right. Exactly, yeah. And Eve is his wife, played by Shirley MacLaine. So she was in the limousine, you see, and she's concerned for Chance because he's been injured very slightly on the knee or something, and so she's concerned that perhaps he might sue and bring embarrassment to the Rand family name or something. And anyway, so she takes him to her home to recuperate. And in the car she mishears him say Chance the gardener, and she thinks that his name is Chauncey Gardner, and that's where he actually gets his name from, because he doesn't have a name, doesn't have a proper name like that, Chauncey Gardner. Anyway, then Benjamin Rand really takes to Chance and starts to think that he's a profound man, so his natural sort of reserved manner is taken for good breeding, and his old-fashioned clothes for super smartness, be well brought up, and he's wearing clothes from decades in the past, and every time that Chance makes simple statements about gardening, then Ben takes that as a profound metaphor for business growth and the economy.
Yes.
That leads then eventually to meetings with the President of the United States, because Ben is, I'm going to say it this way, he's on very good terms with the President. I'll have more to say about that in a minute. And this then leads the President to thinking that Chance is profound as well. So Chance gets on TV and he's a great success, and all his metaphors are therefore interpreted by the show host of the TV program, and so the audience love him, the watching audience love him as well, and think that he's something fresh on the political scene.
Yeah.
Anyway, Benjamin Rand dies, and at his funeral, while the president is delivering his speech, the coffin bearers, the pallbearers, quietly talk about, well, who's going to be the next president of the United States? And they quietly whisper that, yeah, Chauncey Gardner. And as this coffin is slowly carried towards the Rand family tomb, that family tomb is in the shape of a pyramid with the Eye of Horus over the top. It's a wonderful, wonderful moment. And you think that's going to be the end, and yet there's a really surreal moment then where Chance wanders off aimlessly across the water.
Walks on water.
He walks on water, as the president quotes Benjamin Rand saying, "Life is a state of mind."
Yeah.
So it's absolutely packed full of commentary, really. I thought that this character Chance is he's entirely a creation of corporate interest and the media. He does have a personality, but it's absolutely minimal. So it's virtually, one could say, he has no personality, he has no ideas, he just is a nothing, He's just there, being there, and he's moulded by all these forces. In the film, they misunderstand him, but that's a device, really, for this. But essentially, he's moulded by all this. And I couldn't help but think of George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Because how did Bush come to be president? Just by being there, in a sense, by being the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. I'm not saying he was simple-minded, as Chauncey, of course, but I understand that he was a fairly average student at Yale. but essentially just there, belonging to the right family. And Chance is, as I say, a creation of the media. But he literally was right from the beginning as well, because right from the beginning of the program, he's there copying the things that he sees on TV, how people shake hands and how people hold each other in an embrace and all this. So that theme runs all the way through, that he is a construct. He also has no history. The Secret Service are desperately trying to find out anything they can about this Chauncey Gardner as he becomes more and more, in the limelight. And because he lived in that old house, just tending the garden, he has no history. And that reminded me of the obscurity, of course, of Barack Obama's past, and how people have said, did he go to this college? Did he go there? I was at that course, and I don't remember him there, and nobody I know remembers him. And all of these kinds of claims, of course, have been challenged and the like. But nevertheless, there is an obscurity, isn't there? There is a kind of murkiness to Obama's past, and I think that's useful, isn't it? Perhaps you can shape how the system can shape such a person, free from the constraints that your past might impose. So, they did remind me of that. So, of course, he's mistaken as profound. The media makes him seem profound, and he becomes a success with the public because of that, because they're desperate for change. He's like a sort of product, a media product that's sold to the audience. Another thing is that the president in this movie is clearly subservient to Benjamin Rand. That power relationship is very, very clear that, it's the president who visits Rand. It's not the other way around. Rand clearly speaks as if he's a president picker, and also the pallbearers, whoever they are, they're choosing who's going to be the next president. So that's a very clear power relationship in the film. The obscene wealth and the detachment of Benjamin Rand. I mean, he comes over as a kind of nice sort of grandfatherly figure, but nevertheless he's obscenely wealthy. He's detached from the real world, and you see that clearly in his private hospital, because he's dying of this young person's disease, he says, where he has to constantly have all these blood transfusions just to keep him alive.
Yeah.
And these weird scenes of this private hospital and the austere grandeur of the house and these servants. And as we said before, there's that hint of secret societies there with the family tomb and the occult symbol over the door, which I find fascinating. That should be hinted at too. And I think the brilliance of it as a comedy production, there are so many factors to this. As I mentioned before, the slow growth of the comedy, so it changes, it's almost like it's changing in style as it goes through and speeding up, so it becomes more comic towards the end in a faster way. And the absolute deadpan performance of Sellers and the use of minimal music, Eric Satie's minimalist style piano music, and the use of surrealist imagery, I think in the style of Magritte, especially at the end, you know, when he's walking on water with his hat and his umbrella and all that, and just immediately think of those images there. And really the persistence of this same truth joke all the way through, that he is a puppet in the making, formed by these powerful forces. You know, it's exaggerated, of course, but it's telling us something true about the world that we live in, isn't it? And so I thought that whole allegory of the film was brilliant, really, and I do consider that to be a truth movie in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah. The only time I've ever seen that film was about 5 or 6 years ago. And I have to say, I didn't actually like the film when I saw it, but I've got a feeling if I watched it again, I'd probably feel completely differently about it. Maybe I was just seeing it more as a straight story. Maybe that's where I was at whenever I watched it. I just thought it was so implausible, but I think now I realise that's kind of the point, really, isn't it?
Yeah. It's one of those things where, in a way, you sort of need to see it all the way through to the end and then see that pyramid in that eye and think, oh, wow, that's weird, and then think, oh, yeah, that's the kind of thing it's about. Then perhaps watch it a second time.
Yeah, that's right. Because when I watched it, the things I remembered, actually, and the things that I've just remembered as you've been talking, the thing about being shaped by television, and I'd forgotten that Chauncey Gardiner wasn't his real name. And, of course, James Evan Pilato of Media Monarchy, who works with James Corbett, he calls Barack Obama Barry Sartoro, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah.
So apparently he thinks that's his real name. Mm-hmm. But, when I first watched it, it was... I just sort of recently sort of come into all this sort of truth movement information. And I watched it and I just thought, that's a good film. I like Peter Sellers and everything. Wasn't that mad keen on it. And then, just literally the last 30 seconds, suddenly you see the casket and then the eye. And I've just been given all this Illuminati information. And I just thought, what the, and then, but isn't the line at the end something like, as long as we've got an idiot in the White House, we'll be fine, or something like that?
I actually don't recall that, actually, but you might well be right.
I think I just watched the clip recently.
Okay.
Oh, maybe it's as long as we've got Chauncey Gardiner in the White House, we can control it. Oh, that's implied.
It's what I absolutely implied. Definitely. And again, we don't know who these pallbearers are. They're a load of faceless people, but they're clearly important, as it were. They're clearly powerful. They're in with Benjamin Rand. They're decision makers. Presumably, they're members of this secret society.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They're going in, aren't they, with the coffin into the pyramid?
Yeah.
And they're going to choose the next president of the United States.
I don't think the story without the allegory is too brilliant. I don't know. If you took out the allegories, would it be a great film? I don't know. Wouldn't it be more like just a really implausible story? Or...
Well, it might be, I suppose, perhaps like Forrest Gump.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I didn't like Forrest Gump. That's probably why I didn't like being there originally.
All right. Well, I think I didn't like Forrest Gump much because I like being there, but there you go.
Oh, okay. But it seems like one of those films where you can't separate it from all the allegories, all the imagery. I don't actually remember that much comedy in it. It wasn't really gags, was it? Was it just...
Not really gags, no. But this is what I find so remarkable about it. It's like a massive joke in slow motion, which is extraordinary. Yeah. But once you have that joke all the time in the back of your mind, and you're sort of appreciating how it's unfolding, I sort of watch it in a state of amusement. If that makes any sense.
I'm going to watch it again and get back to you sometime.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll watch it with sort of fresh eyes.
Yeah. Okay, back to you. You wanted to talk about a couple of your heroes, may I call? Carlin and Hicks. So, over to you.
Definitely comedy heroes. I think Bill Hicks a bit more than George Carlin, but I'll talk about Bill Hicks first. So, Yeah, he was stand-up comedian. I think he started when he was very young, but his sort of peak period was sort of late 80s, early 90s. And he actually died in 1994, I think, and he was only 33. I think he died of pancreatic cancer. He was a heavy smoker.
Right.
I think at the time that he was around, he was fairly well known. I mean, he was on a couple of British shows as well, and he appeared on the Letterman show a few times. Had to sort of slightly sanitize his act, as you can imagine. And one of his acts was actually banned from the Letterman show. That's become sort of all these things that they always become more interesting to people when they're banned, as you know.
Yes.
But since this sort of alternative media has arisen in the last, say, 6 or 7 years, he's become, as George Carlin has, a real guru to these people, because people are realizing that the stuff he was talking about, and this was back in the 90s, just as Yes Minister was back in the 80s, we're starting to realize that what he was saying was very prescient. So I'll briefly go over a few things. He was a Texan, and he was around at the time of the Waco siege. And for anyone who doesn't really know anything about that or doesn't know anything beyond the mainstream story, there's a very good documentary called Waco Rules of Engagement. There is lots of evidence saying that the mainstream version is not accurate or entirely accurate. And Bill Hicks actually drove to the compound and witnessed some of what was going on. What I like about him is that he's able to combine comedy and profundity actually in the same joke, not only in the same sort of routine, but at the same time, which I think is an amazing skill. And he does a joke about David Koresh, this guy who was apparently promoting himself as the messiah of this cult, which included a lot of women and children. And David Koresh's real name was Vernon. And Bill Hicks used to say, if you were called Vernon, wouldn't you want to be Jesus? I mean, come on, the guy's name's Vernon. And he's making fun of the name Vernon and saying no one's going to worship someone called Vernon. So he had to change his name to Koresh and promote himself
Right.
as Jesus. Then in the same routine, he very sort of quickly moves it on to talking about some of the video that was on public access TV in America. Which I think it's C-SPAN, but I may be wrong. And you can clearly see that the Bradley tanks, which are the government tanks, shooting fire into the compound. And Bill Hicks, basically, I feel that he was using a technique which was making people laugh, disarming them, and then hitting them with something serious. Not to beat around the bush, he said, this proves, doesn't it, that, Clinton and Janet Reno are liars and murderers, which is strong stuff, particularly sort of 30 seconds after a gag about a guy called Vernon. So he had a very good technique. I mean, he was a master of comedy. I mean, he started doing stand-up, I think, when he was about 13, so he was well seasoned by the time he was 30 years old.
I haven't seen a great deal of his stuff, but the thing that really struck me at the clips that I was looking at was his routine on JFK.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought that was very cleverly done.
Yeah.
As you say, playing on something which is disturbing, and yet somehow had that ability to bring out the absurdity of the official position about it at the same time. He was actually talking about, the head going in the wrong direction from the official story.
Back and to the left.
That's right.
Yeah.
And constantly sort of saying to the audience, not actually saying, but, to implying to the audience all the time, but shouldn't it come from the other side? Shouldn't we come from the other side? But no, it's going this way. But no, we shouldn't, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
And then his technique was achieving that. So I was very impressed with that.
Yeah, and another great routine, because he did the JFK routine a few times, but he always changed it slightly. And he said, I love talking about JFK because it's a great example of how the totalitarian government who rules this planet partitions out information in such a way that we, the masses, are forced to base our conclusions on erroneous... And he says, sorry, wrong meeting. That's the meeting at the docks. And he said, God, what's strange about that? Everyone went with me. No one stopped me. And in a way, he's almost telling people that they were realizing that he's probably telling the truth subconsciously. So he's making fun of conspiracy theory while sort of implying that he believes in it. And then also he said there's now an assassination museum, which is in the book depository. He says, I think it was named after the assassination, but I'm not sure of the chronology. This is the great bit. He says, you can't actually go to the Cypress Nest where Oswald supposedly fired the bullets. And he said, do you know why? And he said, because they don't want thousands of American tourists going there and going, there's no way, I can't even see the road. Which again, it's brilliant. And you have to think, well, why would they have an assassination museum, but they're not actually letting you see the point where he fired the bullets? And I mean, I haven't been to Texas, but I'd imagine that Bill Hicks is probably right. You'd get there and think, well, that'd be difficult, moving target from that range. So very, very clever.
Was it Bill Hicks who also did that routine that you discussed before when we were talking about taking the latest president to watch the Zapruder film? Was that the one?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'm going to quote. He just said, I have this feeling that whoever is elected president, like Clinton was, and Clinton was president in the 90s, no matter what you promise on the campaign trail, blah, 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 when you win, you go into a smoke-filled room with the 12 industrialists who run the world and got you in there, and you're in this smoky room and this film screen comes down and a big guy with a cigar goes, roll the film. And it's a shot of the Kennedy assassination from an angle you've never seen before that looks suspiciously like it's from the grassy knoll. And I think he actually did another routine where he said, if you look very closely, the gun's got CIA written on the side of it. And then the screen goes up and the lights come up and they say to the new president, any questions? And the president just says, just what my agenda is. That's all.
Yes, priceless.
And,
priceless.
When I heard that, I was talking to a friend of mine. I was saying, can you imagine like Obama in 2009? He goes in to meet the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is all the old generals, the military advisors, and saying, by the way, guys, there's going to be no more war from now on. Can you imagine the belly laugh he'd get from them? The idea that the president could go in there, Mr. Anti-War, and actually tell the top general advisors, military advisors, there's going to be no more war. I mean, it's absurd. It's a war economy at the end of the day. So I think he was well on the mark there.
And the curious thing about that JFK joke you counted there is that, I get the impression that a lot of people would find themselves almost with a kind of gut reaction to that and laughing, who would, in just a normal conversation, perhaps not want to go there at all.
Yes.
The comedy has that power to break through and sort of release that pressure valve.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually do a little bit of stand-up comedy myself. I mean, just literally about sort of 5 gigs, newcomer stuff. And one of the things is that when you have a good compere, and I don't know if Bill Hicks had a compere, but the compere gets everyone in a certain mood. There's obviously a couple of drinks flowing at the same time. And comedy, you're right, it has that license. When people are at a comedy show, they just feel free because they feel like someone like Bill Hicks or Carlin or whoever, they're kind of fairly out there guys. And you feel like, probably subconsciously, they're allowing me to indulge what I think is probably true, but I'm generally too scared to talk about, in the office or wherever. I think you're absolutely right there. The other thing that's very interesting and is a very direct correlation is that when Bill Hicks was doing his routines, the Gulf War was going on, the first Gulf War, which is, 1991. And what's incredibly interesting is that virtually everything he's saying could be applied to the second Iraq War in 2003. He says, I've got some news for you. There never was a war in Iraq. A war is where 2 sides are fighting. And then he gives a statistic about the discrepancy in the casualties. And I don't remember the Iraqi casualties, but it's something like, 50,000. American casualties, 79. He says, does that mean if we'd sent 80 guys, we still would have won? And I mean, again, it's brilliant. I mean, he's making a brilliant point. And another skit he does. Have you ever seen the movie Shane with Jack Palance? He just references one scene where Jack Palance is this gunslinger. And he says he's forcing this goat herder. And when I thought of goat herder, I suddenly thought Afghanistan, because Afghanistan's full of goat herders, sort of mounted people who, probably know nothing about 9/11 or what's going on politically. And in this film, he said Jack Palance is saying to the goat herder, pick up the gun. And the goat herder's going, no, I don't want any trouble. No, I don't want to pick up the gun. He's going, no, mister, I'm just here with my family. I don't want any trouble. Pick up the gun. And then the goat herder picks up the gun and Shane shoots him and says, you saw him? He had a gun. And I mean, there you go, selling weapons to the enemy, and then as soon as they use them, we wipe them out. I mean, the other thing he says, everyone got very excited about the weapons, incredible weapons. And again, as just a reference that maybe we could put a link to, there's a documentary called Militainment Inc., and if you've never seen it, it's absolutely essential because it's all about how the media spun the Iraq War. And a lot of it is them talking about how wonderful the technology is. And you get these sort of light-hearted reports from Fox of like their embedded journalists, admiring these weapons. And Bill Hicks said, how did America know they had the weapons? And he said, they had incredible weapons. We know. We saw the receipts.
Okay.
So, obviously saying that Americans saw the weapons. And I actually have a person that's very close to me who I'd rather not name because I don't want to implicate them, who actually used to work at Heathrow Airport and actually saw planes going off with weapons from British companies being shipped off to Iraq. So he almost literally saw the receipts. I don't know if he literally did, but, you know, and Bill Hicks just said this one other thing about everyone's so impressed with these sort of stealth bombs and everything, but couldn't you use that technology to shoot food at hungry people? And then he does a routine, the stealth banana, with this amazing technology shooting bananas down to hungry people. I mean, it's brilliant stuff, you know, absolutely brilliant.
And you find a similar kind of brilliance in Carlin as well, don't you, George Carlin?
Yeah.
I mean, the trouble is, he's so anti-religion, he's so anti-Christian specifically as well, that I find it difficult to engage with him, I have to say. You sent me this link, didn't you, to a routine that he did where he's actually criticising, well, he's purporting anyway to criticise Christianity, but I have to say, virtually everything that he says in that I don't recognise as being what I believe.
Yes.
So that's a curious thing there where, I'm somehow associated with this criticism that's going on, which is very expertly done, I have to say. I admire his skill, but I think he's attacking a straw man there, and it's difficult for me to engage with him because of that.
Yeah, George Carlin, over time I've come to like him a bit less than I did before. I sort of realised at a point that he's got his audience in his pocket, and his audience will laugh at anything he says. And actually, when I sent you that thing about religion, I was impressed by your reply, because he suddenly made me realise that, what he's saying is incredibly surface. I mean, he was saying people have been convinced that there's an old man in the sky who, if you don't follow him, is going to condemn you to a hellfire and brimstone, but he loves you. And I think it's sort of relevant to people that are not very discerning in their beliefs, which is probably true of almost anything. Comedy can be dangerous in the hands of people who don't want to think for themselves.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I recognise many of the things he says in that as being on the lips of the kind of Christian preacher that I wouldn't want having to do with. I'm aware that there are such people who say things like that, who are quite ignorant in their articulation of Christianity, but if you're then going to imply that all Christians are the same, well, you could do that with anything, couldn't you? You could find the worst example of something, hold that up as your straw man, and then knock it down. What's really been achieved with that? But I mean, on a technical level, I can see that he was brilliant. The example you've just shown there.
But he loves you.
That's right, but he loves you, yes. The way that was delivered, he built it up and then threw that punchline in there, I have to say was brilliantly done, but the content was arrogant and ignorant.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, but Hicks and Carlin are both fantastic timing, but, that's probably from doing, 200 to 300 gigs a year.
Sure, craftsman, there's no doubt about it, yeah. Although there's one thing I would say, actually, on the craftsmanship element, and that is the overuse of swearing, actually.
Yes.
Because I do think that swearing can be used as a device in your comedy really effectively.
Yeah.
But when you pepper it full of swear words, they lose their currency, and this is one of the things that the comic Frank Skinner here in the UK has said, that he's got to the point where he just thinks it has no currency anymore, so at least as far as he's concerned, he's going to knock it down to an absolute minimum so that when it does happen, then it really has an effect. And I think he's got a good point, actually.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know if you've ever seen the play The Caretaker by Harold Pinter.
Yes. Yeah,
yes,
I like Pinter.
It's just 3 actors in it. It's a tramp and 2 brothers. And right at the end, one of the brothers just says to the tramp, "You stink." And without swearing, it's just delivered in such a good way, and it's such a good line, that it's just the ultimate insult. And I think the way he delivers it is far more dismissive than using swearing. So I agree with you. I mean, I like Joe Rogan's podcast, but when Joe Rogan has certain people on there, it's just F this and F that. And it's not that I'm offended in the slightest. It's more that it's not effective because it's just repeating this. It's almost like repeating another word. If I kept repeating the same word all the time, it would get boring, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yeah, expansion of the 4-letter word supply. It results in inflation.
Yeah. So I think one sort of difference in Hicks and Carlin, I think Hicks was slightly more heartfelt, and I think Carlin. Right. I mean, he was a non-political comedian for nigh on 30 years, I think. It was only towards the end of his life, when he's probably in his 70s, that he maybe had an awakening, there you go, and changed his style. But can I just quote you a couple of Carlin?
Sure.
A couple of my favourites. His most famous speech, I think, is called The Owners of the Country, and you can find that on YouTube. He says, it's never ever going to be fixed. It's never going to get any better because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget politicians, they're an irrelevancy. Politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They've got the judges in their back pockets, and they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all the news and information you hear. They spend billions of dollars each year lobbying to get what they want. They want more from themselves and less for everyone else. What they don't want is a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interests. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table figuring out how badly they're getting screwed. They want obedient workers. They want people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, but just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly bad jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, reduced benefits, etc. And now they're coming for their social security. And they'll get it sooner or later because they own this place. It's a big club and you ain't in it. That's the last line. It's a big club and you ain't in it. There's great timing, I can't repeat this timing.
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it, that virtually everything said there was not funny.
Exactly.
But it built up to that point where you put the punchline there on the end, and then the whole thing became funny and true at the same time.
When you hear him say that, and he's clearly not reading a speech, it's so powerful when someone says all that stuff and it just comes out with passion and in a torrent, it's very powerful. And the other one is pretty similar. I mean, it's just a quick quote. Politicians are in place to give the public the illusion that they have choice. All the important things such as media and politics are illusions of choice narrowed down to nothing. But there are 20 types of bagel. The limits of presidential debates are established before they even begin. Anyone outside those limits is a communist, extremist, kook, conspiracy theorist. It can't be entertained for a minute that powerful people might get together and have a plan. It doesn't happen. You're a kook and a conspiracy buff. In reality, you don't need a conspiracy when you have similar interests and don't need to call a meeting. These people go to the same country clubs and belong to think tanks. And he's talking generally about Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg. Yeah, that's it. And of course, this is me talking now. Illuminati is the buzzword, but someone used it against me recently because it sounds more mystical. No one can defend the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission. But Illuminati is an easy one because it sounds sort of mystical.
That's right.
And
yes.
It may or may not exist.
Yeah.
But I like the George Carlin, The Illusion of Choice. I think that's great. You've got 25 flavours of ice cream, but the real choices are narrowed down to virtually nothing. It's great stuff. Yeah, being a fan of Bill Hicks and George Carlin, it's hard to find people that are quite as edgy as them now. But someone who's sort of becoming like that is Louis C.K., who's had his own series, and I've followed him for a few years. And he's gradually sort of phasing out the more silly stuff and trying to be a bit more profound. And there's one thing he does all about technology. He says, you need the ability to be yourself, which is what technology has taken away. It's taken away our ability to be ourselves. Because beneath everything we all have this emptiness. It's buried deep, and we realise that in a lot of ways we're alone in the world. And he said, now, when I feel sad, I let myself be sad, and I cry my eyes out if I want to. But most people, what they do is, the moment they feel a bit sad, they get their phone out and they start texting and saying hi to 50 people, looking forward to that lovely moment when everyone replies to you. He said some people text and drive and would rather kill someone in their car than feel sad for a second. And he said, sadness is poetic. It's a great clip. He's on the Conan O'Brien show. So,
well, I often think that boredom is actually very important.
Yeah,
one of the things that my daughter frequently says is, well, I'm bored, and then she fills it in, as you say, with messing about with her iPod or something like that. And I frequently say to her, well, actually, sometimes it's a good thing to be bored, because then you start to introspect, and you start to philosophize, and you pick up a book, and you become creative, and without that space...
as I think we were saying last time we spoke, I think people are afraid of the silence. They're afraid of the space. They've got to fill it with something, and I think getting yourself away from things as well. It's difficult to be creative when you've got so many things which are just laid on for you. They're just a button away. And television's, of course, a good example because you're not doing any work. You're a sort of passive observer, and everything is being given to you.
So you have no space to reflect on who you are. what life's about and perhaps reach life-changing conclusions. But if you're constantly looking at that little screen, you can't do it.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd say to anyone, if you really want to confront yourself, do a 10-day silent meditation retreat, and you'll soon realise what you are and what you aren't. It's incredible.
I wanted to say something kind of not exactly negative about comedy itself, because I think of comedy as a tool, but therefore negative in the sense that any tool can be wielded for good purposes or bad. It's a power that I think can obscure truth, not just uncover it.
Yeah.
This is something that I experience when I watch programs like QI, Mock the Week, sometimes Have I Got News for You, these very successful programs here in the UK. And not all the time, but nevertheless, I do sometimes experience that sense of comedy actually working to obscure truth, because often there's a kind of group think, a group feel amongst these comedians and the audience, and the whole thing, of course, has been created by producers, so the personality and thoughts of the producer are projected onto this whole sociological space that's there. And it's very difficult for people who might disagree with whatever the wisdom of the group is to express dissent. And so you will get some consensus view on something that's being joked about, and you think to yourself, well, there must be occasionally somebody on the panel who doesn't like that, who disagrees, but you know that they can't stand aside from it and disagree, because they would then be a killjoy. And so it's a whole limiting process that's going on there, a very powerful one. I mean, I experienced this particularly with one episode of Have I Got News for You, where Dan Snow, the presenter Dan Snow, was on the programme, and he made some kind of tangential remark about JFK's assassination. I can't remember what he said, but he gave the impression anyway that he didn't believe the official position about it. And there was silence. There was a definite sense that was not the kind of thing that you should say on that programme. And that groupthink mentality was so strong that nobody who might actually agree with Dan Snow was able to express anything. There wasn't much reaction from the audience either. So it's a very powerful situation that's set up there. And I was disappointed that Ian Hislop, I think, didn't react in the normal way that he would have done. Whether he agree or disagree, I think he would normally have reacted. If he'd have agreed, he'd probably have done a kind of shock horror face and turned to the audience, oh, you mean you don't believe the official story? That sort of thing. Or he could have done the opposite thing, and say, oh, I see you're wearing a tin hat today, or something like tinfoil hat. But he shut up. Everybody shut up. And so it was a really interesting situation there, where the whole comic space was a cloud. And so the tool, I think, was being used inappropriately there by whoever set up that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking that I'm not sure. I'm sure you're right, but I'm not sure whether it even matters that it was a comedy program. I think that would happen in anything, because you have the mainstream line. And
yeah, but the point is that comedy never takes place in a non-sociological context. You've got a person who's telling the joke, as it were, and you've got an audience. There's always some kind of context there, isn't there? I mean, I experience this in my personal life. There are some people who expect me to be funny, and so I can make some lame joke and you get a big laugh. And then there are other social contexts in which you're not expected to be the person who's funny, and you make perhaps a really good quip, and nobody laughs or whatever, which is embarrassing. And I've always found that one difficult to judge, actually. So comedy is always a sociological thing that's going on. So I agree, it can happen in lots of contexts, not just in a comic context, but it is a tool that functions in that way. And so I think we need to be aware that it has its negative side as well. So very often that the idea is that if a joke is made and it's funny, there's that sense of, oh, that's so true. And it can have the power of making you feel, oh, that's so true. But as I said before, if the premises are wrong, if the social context is wrong, actually you can be kidded almost into thinking, oh, that's so true, when it actually isn't true.
I'll tell you what else I was just thinking when you're saying that. When you've got an edgy comedian, supposedly edgy comedian, like Bill Maher in America, Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, and maybe Stephen Colbert, when you've got those guys on mainstream TV, because they're considered edgy, and by mainstream standards they are quite edgy. Bill Maher, of course, famously chucked some 9/11 truthers out of his studio. What I realised, if you really think about that closely, Bill Maher's edgy. I mean, he got sacked because he said that suicide bombers weren't cowards. Isn't it more cowardly to drop a drone than to blow yourself up? Which, I would agree with. But because in the mainstream he's considered edgy, the fact that he's throwing 9/11 truthers out of studio is saying to people, well, Bill Maher's really out there, but even he's not so out there to think 9/11 could have been not what we think it was. So it's very clever, I don't know whether that's completely contrived, but I think you're right. And I've made brief mention of Ian Hislop in my blog post, because not only is he on Have I Got News For You, but he's editor of a newspaper or a magazine called Private Eye, which, again, it spends all its time exposing corruption, left, right and centre, every single issue about, politicians taking backhanders. But as soon as there's anything resembling an alternative explanation, it's, cartoons of tinfoil hats. It's so frustrating. That Ian Hislop, for example, frustrates me a lot. So, yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Well, I wanted to move on to something that seems a little unrelated at first sight. But at the beginning, I said that I thought we would discuss truth comedy in the sense of pinpointing things that are external going on in the world, but also internal going on inside our own worlds. And I wanted to mention a couple of heroes of mine who I think did this brilliantly, and that's Andy Kaufman and Spike Milligan, funnily enough. And I think they were helping us to kind of reassess our assumptions about reality, the kind of things that we unthinkingly take for granted. I certainly consider that to be part of what the truth movement is about. It's not just an external thing, is it? It's also assessing ourselves and critically examining what it is we believe to be true. And I make that quite clear that I don't think the result of that is necessarily to jettison everything you believe to be true, but to submit it to critical thought. So I want to just start with Andy Kaufman. He never claimed to be a comedian as such, but he claimed to be an artist, a performance artist. Now, maybe that was a joke in itself, I don't know, but I don't think so. I take him literally on that. So I remember him doing what I would call performance art events or happenings that sort of coincide with what many people would classify as comedy. So, of course, he was therefore performing in comedy contexts. But he would, as he did that performance in that comedy context, he would then break so many of the rules of what's expected. And so much of what he was doing was also involving the audience. The actual reaction of the audience is inseparable from the performance itself, which I thought was remarkable. Often with a comedian, you could have the jokes there and you could understand the joke and you could sort of sit back, on your TV and watch a performance. It didn't matter whether the audience there, you could have canned laughter or something. But with this, there's no way you could do that because he was interacting with the audience and getting audience up and insulting them or whatever, or getting stooges up and insulting them. And you could see, in that particular example that I sent the link to you, this was of his performance, it's 1977 at the HBO, that's the home box office cable channel, Young Comedians Impro special that they had there. And I think it's an amazing performance where he starts off on the stage by telling bad jokes. And it doesn't get much of a laugh, sort of sympathy laughs, And then he starts to appear nervous and a bit upset, and he tells some more weak jokes. And then he pretends not to understand why everybody's laughing in the wrong places. And he starts apologizing for being there, and then he leaves the stage. And then he comes back on and he starts to apologize some more, and he starts crying, And you can tell that some of the audience sort of understand this is a performance, and you can get the impression on some people's faces they don't know what's going on. And then that sobbing becomes rhythmic, and that then allows him to join in with that rhythm on the drums, on the timbale that are there. And so that's a segue into that drum performance, and that then allows everybody to understand that the whole thing was a performance, because it's now, da-da, that's the end of the performance. So the whole thing then is understood as being this kind of happening, this rather than what you'd normally expect to be a comedy routine. But so, what is going on with that? He claimed that it wasn't comedy, so I think it was performance art, and I think essentially it was kind of messing with people's heads, messing with people's expectations. It's redefining the experience that people are having. I think it's art in this wider sense. So therefore, it's causing people, if you actually reflect upon it, to question the very assumptions that you bring to the performance that you've come to see. So I think, therefore, and this is the way I interpret it, that invites you to reflect more generally about your assumptions. Why are you categorizing things in the way that you are? Is it because you've thought that through? Or is it because you're just accepting what you've been taught, you've been indoctrinated with, or this is so-and-so?
Yeah.
And he's breaking all that apart. And I think it's very much related to the kind of surrealist, particularly the Fluxus movement in the 1960s, where you got people like, John Cage and
Stockhausen.
Yeah, exactly. And just sort of out of my head, I remember reading a brochure about the Fluxus movement, and there was a guy called Nam June Paik, who was a Korean-American artist, and I remember reading that he walked up to John Cage and cut his tie off. And that was the performance. And, that's bizarre. You could say, that's comedy, is it? Well, no, it was just a happening. It was an event, and the whole point is to challenge your preconceptions. And I'm quite sure that that's what Kaufman was doing. And I think that's really valuable as a kind of truth comedy, because it's causing you, if you reflect upon it and understand what's going on, to examine your prejudices and your assumptions.
Wow, interesting. I mean, when you sent me the video, I was probably in a bit of a hurry when I watched it. I was probably expecting something along the lines of Hicks or Carlin. I didn't realise it wasn't a political thing, but I did pick up on the fact that it was all ironic and that he was giving a bad comedy performance. Didn't he disappear? Is that right? Because R.E.M. wrote that song about him.
He did die, that's right, and then there was this big thing as had he really died? Because he did so many stunts that there was a big question about that. How he's going to reappear.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll investigate some more of that. But I did notice the irony, and I was noticing that he was challenging the audience to I don't know, abuse him or do something,
Yeah.
And then he started abusing them.
That's right. And another guy that I wanted to mention, of course, was Spike Milligan. This is different again because obviously his claim was to be a comedian, but I think his comedy was art. Yeah. And I think that at its best, and there were many flops with Milligan, I would agree, but that he sort of had to have that space to make lots and lots of mistakes. Yeah. But occasionally I think he just came up with something which was genius. And I think at his best he does pose questions like, why should comedy be limited by conventions at all? Who says that a sketch must even be classified as a sketch? Why should it have a beginning? Why should it have a middle? Why should it have an end?
Why should it have any gags?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Why should it have gags? Why should it not have gags? Wherever I want them. I noticed so many times in his later series that he would get to the point in obviously writing the sketch thinking, well, now I've got to have some sort of punchline. Where do we go? What am I going to do now is obviously going through his head. And eventually he went for the solution, I know, I'll say, what are we going to do now? So he did. And not only did he do, but all the people who were involved in the sketch all started chanting, what are we going to do now? What are we going and just slope off.
Yeah.
I mean, just absolutely bizarre, but it broke the convention that you had to have a punchline. And Monty Python, of course, was so influenced by this because they had all that sort of, satirical stuff of the Frost Report, and that was the week that was, and all that. And if they'd stayed like that, they would never, of course, risen to the heights that they achieved. They had to have something like Milligan, and they accept that they were influenced by that, in order to have that surreal breaking of all the rules, in order for them to marry the satirical and the surreal and do what they did.
Yeah.
So I think that, Milligan was absolutely brilliant in achieving that. Now, that's all sort of internal to the world of comedy, but Milligan did also have an activist side to him, because he was very active in environmentalism, and he had lots of health, mental health problems himself, so he was active with regard to people coming to understand the issues regarding to mental health. Certainly in his later series, the last one was called There's a Lot of It About, there were lots of concerns about injustice, privilege and class, and these kinds of images came into the comedy as well, so he was making statements about that. So there certainly is a political side to him, but I do agree that a lot of it is centred in the kind of pure comedy constructs that he was breaking apart. But some of those are absolutely brilliant. I've just got to mention it. This is my favourite sketch, and I think a lot of people listening may not connect with this because you actually have to see it. It happens in about a minute, and it's just two people. On one side of the stage, you have a guy comes in, he's dressed in overalls, covered in paint, he's got a paint pot and a brush, and he's got a stepladder. There's no doubting what he is, right? He comes and erects this stepladder at the side of the stage, and he stands there, 10, 15 seconds. Then Spike Milligan appears the other side of the stage dressed as a monk and just looks out at the audience with praying hands. Then he just turns to the other guy and he says, is that your stepladder? And the man says, no. Is it yours? And then the monk pulls out a banana, shows it to the audience and says, yes, it is. And then the curtain closes. And that's it. And I've actually done that myself half a dozen times or so. I've performed that with another person in various social contexts, and it's fascinating to see the reaction because you get silence, 4 or 5 seconds, where the audience just thinks, what on earth is that? That doesn't make any sense. And then you can hear that people start to get bits of the many jokes that are packed into that, because it's like a gem packed with several jokes into just a few seconds. And they start to get it, and then you get waves of laughter. And I'm not claiming to be a great performer, you know what I mean? I've just done it. It's the material itself just works. And what I find remarkable about it is that if you start analysing it, as the audience does begin to do in those few seconds of reaction, you start to say, well, the stepladder is obviously belongs to that man. So why does the monk ask that question? Is that your stepladder? That's obvious. So that's one ridiculous thing to start with. So, and then why does the man say no? It's not my stepladder. Because it is his stepladder. He came on with it. So why then does he say to the monk, is it yours? Because the monk has just asked him that question, so it makes no sense to ask the monk if it's his, because obviously it's not his. And then the monk produces this different object and answers the question they've been asking all along in relation to the stepladder. He answers it with respect to this other object that he's brought into play. None of it makes any sense. It's all layers of ridiculousness, and it's so quick, And then there's the inevitable sexual innuendo as well, because it's a banana. But actually, it isn't an innuendo at all. It's just a kind of symbol of a joke that would, in another context, say a carry-on film, would be understood in that way. So if you think as an audience member that it's innuendo, especially if you're upset by that, then you've actually yourself imported that into the sketch. You've imported that interpretation. So you're showing yourself to be hypocritical because you're complaining about something that you yourself have brought into the sketch. And all that is going on in just a few words. And I think that is genius. And the more I sort of reflect on that kind of thing, the more I think he's actually inviting us to question everything about what we expect a performance to be. And I think that has to raise it to the level of art, I think.
Wow. And question whether your thoughts are really your own as well.
Yes.
I think in a way, if you do something absurd which has absolutely no meaning at all even, I think in a way you're just commenting on the absurdity of the world, frankly. John Cleese said about 10 years ago, he said, I'm in my 60s now, and what I've realised is the world's a madhouse. No one's really in control. You've got laws, but no one's in control. No one really knows what they're doing. We're all actors. We're all acting. The world's a madhouse, and when you realise that, it's freeing in a way. It's
Well, that's another dimension to it. And in some respect, I'm going to go so far as to say that I think that's its own kind of deception, because that sort of implies that the world is actually these sort of free flux of uncontrolled things, which goes against many of the things that we've been talking about, where we're saying that actually a lot of life is controlled by ruling elites and the like. So my reaction to this kind of surrealism is that it's freeing, as you say, but if we take it to extreme and say that there's no structure, there's no truth, there's a postmodern kind of extreme, I think that's actually destructive of critical thought. I think it just needs to free us from prejudices, things that we've not thought through properly. That's the reaction that I have to this kind of thing.
But I think the sort of world's a madhouse. That'd be a good segue to Strangelove, actually, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yeah, well, it would, indeed. I suppose we've got to mention Strangelove, haven't we? Quick mention. So,
quick mention. Yeah.
Well, I think it's so well known, isn't it? What should we say about it? The kind of issues that were brought up, satirising the idea of mutually assured destruction and the missile gap and the idea that you could win a nuclear war. I think it's absolutely brilliant satire.
Yeah, and I mean, just the fact that the people in charge, who we think are level-headed and irrational, may be sort of mad or buffoons or worse, Obviously, the Doctor Strangelove character herself, everyone will remember the fact that his arm keeps going into a Heil Hitler position and he keeps slapping it down. He's desperate not to make the Hitler sign. And
I read, actually, that was Peter Sellers' own idea, apparently.
I think it was, yeah. And actually, just as an aside, anyone who's watching the film, if you watch the Russian ambassador in the background, he can't stop laughing, the actor. He's trying to stop himself laughing as Peter Sellers is slapping his arm. Yeah, brilliant.
Well, it's a lovely reference there, isn't it, I think, to Operation Paperclip.
Yeah.
The use by the West of Nazi scientists who were criminals, but they were of use.
Which is on Wikipedia, isn't it? So,
what Operation Paperclip is on Wikipedia?
Yeah, I'm just saying Wikipedia tends to not really entertain things which are not provable. So Operation Paperclip is real, like Operation Mockingbird as well is when CIA infiltrating the media. It's real as well. So. Yeah, and just the sort of connection between war and sex. I mean, in the very last scene where Slim Pickens is riding the bomb, which obviously is eventually blowing up the world.
Kong.
That's it, Kong, yeah. Major Kong, that's it. And then we've got the idea, of course, Jack the Ripper. Brilliant Sterling Hayden, who's one of my favourite actors. Of course, he's impotent. He's denying women his essence.
Yeah.
And, of course, that brings up the idea that war is covering up inadequacy, basically. And I mean, there's this terrible quote that is just so chilling. and it was something to do with George W. Bush saying he was going to finish off what his father started, because of course George H.W. Bush was involved with the first Gulf War. And that idea, of course, that George W. Bush was born with a platinum spoon in his mouth and had failed. I mean, he'd failed with 2 oil companies and had failed at most that he'd done. And I don't know if it's true, but, the idea that he would take out this terrible revenge to cover up all his inadequacies, And I think that's an idea that Kubrick was playing with. And a famous quote of Kubrick's was, "Never ever go near power. Don't become friends with anyone who has real power. It's dangerous." And I think that's pretty profound as well.
And I suppose the point was, say, this whole idea of the mutually assured destruction, this idea of the doomsday machine, with this preposterous thing that was actually thought about and academically considered. And I understand that there were engineers and scientists who thought it might actually be doable. So to say that at the end of the day, there's going to be some weakness in this where it's just a ridiculous notion even to consider. And here you have in the hands of somebody who's not quite right. And if he has that kind of power, the system just goes completely wrong. And it's the madness of this kind of military strategizing and thinking that you can win something like this. What do you make of all the fluoride thing with regard to that character?
I did actually do a blog post, which I haven't posted it yet. There was a speech I listened to a couple of years ago, and the guy was saying that there are actually different types of fluoride, and one is naturally occurring. But hydrofluorosilicic acid, which is supposedly is in the water supply and in toothpaste, it's basically the waste products of certain industries. I can't remember which industry, metal industry or whatever, and they can't dump it legally, so it's put in very small amounts through the water supply.
I think it might be fertilizer.
Yeah, that's right. It's the waste from the fertilizer industry, you're right. And, of course, hydrofluorosilicic acid in its pure form can, burn through metal. I mean, it's absolutely lethal. If you ingested a tiny bit of it in its pure form, you'd be dead,
But the official line, of course, is that it's safe in the levels that are used.
Yeah, but he's talking about officially something like thing is, I can't remember the measurement, so I can't really talk full authority, but there was one measurement which is sort of a pinprick, which is safe, and then 2 pinpricks could cause damage, and then sort of 5 pinpricks can cause like bone damage and fluorosis. So it was the difference between pinpricks was the difference between a safe level and one that can cause fluorosis and bone disease.
Yeah, well, I've heard lots of presentations about it, and I'm quite convinced that it's not something that's safe. But, back in the 50s and 60s, and I know there was concern about it, but it wasn't so widespread as it is today, the concern about it. And so, this guy, Jack D. Ripper, his character is such that he thinks that this is a communist plot, doesn't he?
Yeah.
This is what the Soviets are doing. They're fluoridating the water. And I've heard people say things like, perhaps there's something going on here. There's some sort of message here, saying that conspiracy theorists are not quite right in the head or something.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that's what's going on with this film, because,
I
don't know, things have changed since those days. I mean, if it was sort of generally at that time accepted that, to have those sorts of concern might be associated with somebody who was paranoid, perhaps Kubrick just took that as an example that he could use at the time. Perhaps if he was writing the script these days, it might be different. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think my friend Rob Ager, who we've mentioned before, who's a bit of a Kubrick obsessive, he's fairly sure that Kubrick was very well versed in the sort of alternative view of the world, and I mean, he was a voracious reader, and he never left England, which I thought was interesting. That's one that the conspiracy people perhaps would take as a hint that maybe the authorities were a bit sort of wary of him, that he didn't want to fly, because as we've discussed before, there seem to be a lot of plane crashes in America.
So if that's the case, then what do you think Kubrick was doing with that fluoride connection?
Maybe he was just dropping a hint,
and yet it comes over completely negatively, doesn't it? Because this guy is nuts, and so if he believes such a thing, that's associated with insanity.
Maybe it's the communist element that maybe is more important than the fluoride element, perhaps. Yeah, maybe he was just taking this sort of meme that was out there, which is the fact that fluoride is toxic, and maybe just playing more on the communist angle. As we were saying earlier, and as George Carlin said, these words are so powerful. Kook, communist, conspiracy theorist, and you can just pull out these words, and X amount of people are gonna just take it as read, he's a communist, what does that mean, You don't really have to define what it means. I mean, I'm not defending, Russian communism by any stretch or Chinese communism. But, I mean, just the word on its own, it's given this power that doesn't really warrant just in its pure form,
Right, well, we've been talking for a very, very long time, and one of the things that we were going to mention, which has slipped by actually, was the great piece that James Corbett did on 9/11, A Conspiracy Theory, just a 5 minutes piece, isn't it? And don't want it to go by without mentioning that, because I think it's, James occasionally listens to this show, so I don't know whether we listen to this one, but as he says, I'll say to him, hats off to you, James, for such a brilliant piece, because I think it's sarcasm at its best, really pointing out the absurdities in the official story. The speed of it, the detail, the timing of it creates this kind of cumulative effect, doesn't it, just how ridiculous the official position is. It works really, really powerfully. And I know that he's given permission for people to use the material, so why not listen to it? Should we have a listen?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the budget analyst office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly, answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her. And her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about...
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
And...
They took the babies out of the incubators.
And...
Mobile production facilities.
And...
The rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a paranoid, tinfoil, dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, MSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
My favourite bit is when he says, if you don't believe the official version, you're a kook and a conspiracy theorist, and then he brings up the faces of the people. Don't believe him, or him, or him, or her, or him, or him. He just brings all these people, Sibel Edmonds and Richard Grove and all these people. Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah, indeed.
And just maybe brief mention to Fahrenheit 9/11. I think we've discussed before, Michael Moore doesn't quite go far enough in 9/11, but I think there was enough in that film to get them thinking, George Bush spending 50% of his first 9 months on holiday.
I'm not sure whether to call it a comedy documentary. It's not, is it? It uses comedy elements throughout, but it juxtaposes so often the comic and the tragic really effectively, doesn't he? Politicians standing in front of the camera having their hairstyles done, and what do you get straight after that? You get pictures of the 9/11 attacks and people's reactions to it and how their lives are impacted and changed forever at that moment with this sort of haunting music, and the contrast is just astonishing. So that use of comedy by way of contrast and juxtaposition, I think was brilliantly done, actually. Even as you say, he didn't go far enough with his critique.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quote something from towards the end of the film. He's very much pointing to the fact that it's the poor who are in the situation where they're signing up to go and fight the wars of the rich, and he makes that point really strikingly. And he narrates over various images, and he says, I have always been amazed that the very people forced to live in the worst parts of town, go to the worst schools and have it the hardest, are always the first to step up and defend that very system. They serve so that we don't have to. They offer to give up their lives so that we can be free. It is remarkable, their gift to us, and all they ask for in return is that we never send them into harm's way unless it's absolutely necessary. Will they ever trust us again?
Wow.
Really stirring stuff. And
it is, yeah. I mean, I think he's a good guy, Michael Moore, and his films are well worth watching. As we said, maybe doesn't quite go too far, and he is fully in the mainstream, but yeah, well worth watching. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of subtext to a lot of the stuff I've been talking about is, it's all very well, Yes Minister and everything. It's all very funny, but when you're talking about war and people's lives, it takes on a darker tone. And even, Sir Humphrey Appleby from Yes Minister, you can laugh at some of the stuff, but he's incredibly blasé. And then you've got even Blackadder as well. Blackadder Goes Forth, which is another one that we should at least just mention, is where you see the general sweeping up. Stephen Fry plays the mad General Melcher. I think it's him or Field Marshal Haig, played by Jeffrey Palmer, who's sweeping up the soldiers. He's got toy soldiers and he's sweeping them up. They're just dispensable. That's what it is. I mean, these generals and everything. So all this comedy, it gets dark when you're talking about war, because I don't think people quite realise what war is like. And I mean, I've never been in a war, but I've done extensive reading, and it's one of my obsessions, really. I'm trying to find out precisely why it happens, Is it human nature? Is it just money? Is it just power? It's obviously a mixture of those things, but I don't think people quite realise, because we've just grown up with it. It's a permanent thing.
Well, this is the point that Graham McQueen makes, that it's become a machine, and we somehow got to break that machine. We've got to sort of slow down the parts of it in some way. This is why, because he's an academic in peace studies. So, he was saying that we can't just look at just the reason, why did this war start, or why did that war start? It's more, these wars are going to start because the machine insists that they should.
Yeah, and I mean, again, Dr. Strangelove, I'm sure he's making a nod to that. I mean, and of course it's a business. I mean, anyone who doesn't think war is at least to some extent a business is incredibly naive, and hasn't thought about it at all.
Well, I think the doomsday machine itself is a kind of metaphor for the whole machine of the military-industrial complex, isn't it? Apart from being an actual reference to something that was suggested as a possible idea.
Yeah, but I think Stanley Kubrick was fully aware of what was going on. I don't think there was anything naive about him. very quickly, if you don't mind, one more thing. This is Columbo, and one more thing.
Oh, wow.
Just a quick mention of Russell Brand, just because it's current.
Okay.
Yeah, he's sort of, in the last couple of years, he's sort of manoeuvred himself into a position where he's a voice in the mainstream. He's done stuff with David Icke. He's been on Alex Jones. He's been on the Young Turks. He's been on Max Kaiser's show. So he is an alternative voice, but the problem he's got is that he's still going on sort of silly panel shows and everything. And I actually sent him an email, which he probably hasn't read. He probably gets a lot of email, saying, why don't you, just an idea, why don't you gradually phase out all that stuff and go full-time on something meaningful, and he's doing it through comedy. I mean, when he was at the GQ Awards, he received an award and he said, this is really funny because, Hugo Boss made uniforms for the Nazis. And it's interesting that he's dropping that in, and everyone laughed, and we don't know whether they were laughing because they thought he was joking or laughing because they realised it was true, He's doing an all right job, but what I'd like to see him do is phase out the silly stuff and commit himself a bit more, but presumably he's probably got film contracts and everything, so I know you can't just drop it all instantly.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but, you said that he's manoeuvred himself, but I can't help but think that he's being manoeuvred as well, because he's not a threat. He's not a threat,
Possibly.
is he? I mean, how come he gets that access to, say, go on Newsnight and talk to Paxman? And I think that, listening to that particularly, he came over as... sort of subversive in the in the way we've been talking, but through the lens of the left wing, through the lens of Marxism, and I think a lot of people would see him in that light, and that therefore means he's fitting into the left-right paradigm, and so therefore that's no problem for the mainstream. People are going to understand him in that way, and in a sense that kind of neutralises a lot of what he says, I think.
But is there any chance that he could, if he made, let's say today he made a decision, I'm going to break out of that, what do you think would happen to him? Would he just be discredited? Would something more sinister happen to him,
Who knows? I mean, I'm just thinking a lot of people would have said, well, we saw him on Paxman and he's a Marxist. Well, that's... reject that.
Yeah.
But is he at heart? I don't know. But maybe he genuinely wants to find a new way with things. But, I think the mainstream have very cleverly boxed him in on that one.
I think you're right. I mean, I think he probably is controlled to an extent. But I don't know. I mean, I've never met him, but it's possible that there might be something in him that is a genuine truther, So I guess time will tell if he can break out. But I think definitely as long as he's talking about socialism, if he's part of the left-right paradigm, then he's useless.
Oh, well, yeah.
Time will tell.
Yeah. I suppose we really need to get to a point where we sort of make some kind of conclusions from this. And I suppose I really wanted to say that I think, as I've said a number of times, that I think, comedy is a really valuable and powerful tool. It helps to reveal hidden truths, external ones and internal ones, as we've been discussing. Because it can reveal absurd inconsistencies, hypocrisy, lies, it can do that very powerfully. And therefore, I think at its best it's an art that shouldn't really be pinned down by rules, because as soon as you have rules for something like that, then there are things you can't say or ways in which you can't articulate truths. So that's why I mentioned people like Milligan and Kaufman. I think we're breaking the rules there. But nevertheless, I think there is a danger with it, because comedy also flatters. It engages, but it can also flatter. And in the wrong sort of social context, if somebody's controlling that social context, then it can flatter you to believe things that are false. I know we have discussed this. So I'm saying I think it's a rough tool. We have to be careful of it and use it judiciously, but it's powerful nonetheless, very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, I think I was saying to you off mic, was that could apply to other art forms. If you make a very powerful film about Vietnam, but you portray the Vietnam War in a way which is not accurate, then it's dangerous. And I think the thing with comedy, it has a certain power, it has a certain uniqueness. So that thing of using art for good or bad is slightly heightened with comedy. And you're right, it's very powerful, very powerful.
Yeah, I'm glad that we talked about it.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Really interesting. And of course we've been sharing our particular enthusiasms, but why not? So obviously there are loads of other things that we could have talked about, but they just don't happen to be the things that inspire us. And so we're two people who are speaking about the things that inspire us that coincide with the subject matter we've been talking about. And it's been great, and I sincerely hope that other people enjoy what we've been talking about as well. Do you want to just remind people about how they can find your blog, so that if you put something else up, they can read it?
Yeah, my blog is controvid.blogspot.com, And what it's all really boiling down to, and I mean, even the conclusion to this conversation is we're saying comedy is potentially dangerous in the hands of people that don't think. So essentially, we're just saying, think for yourself. I mean, that's what my blog basically comes down to. It's called Freethinker 75. I didn't realize at the time that Freethinker is also a religious movement of atheists, and I'm nothing to do with that. It's just think for yourself. It's the same mantra. Everything comes down to the same thing. If you don't mind, I'm just going to quickly plug. I've also got a YouTube channel, which is called, surprise, surprise, Contrafib. Contrafib actually comes from a made-up word called contrafibularities, which is on a series called Blackadder. It's a famous episode with a dictionary, which is, again, is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yes, it is. My YouTube channel has got actually music as well, because I'm a musician, and I've got about 30 or 40 self-produced, very lo-fi sort of songs. I use a pseudonym called Eden Roberts, and I've done a few songs with an Indian singer called Ann Wesher. I've done a couple of interviews with David Shaler, XMI5, who's got some very controversial views, but I would say to people, just listen to him, and he's got some pretty good insights. And I've done a few audios of my blog posts, and I'm hoping, I'm just going to say to Julian's audience, I'm hoping to get Julian to do an interview with me for my YouTube channel. I won't get you to promise that on air.
Well, maybe. I shall continue to consider that. And I will say thank you very much, Eden, for joining us on the show. It was great to speak to you again.
No, Eden disappeared a few years ago. I still use his name, but
not under suspicious circumstances, I hope.
No, he didn't disappear. No, but okay. Julian, thanks a lot. It's been very good, and I hope your listeners get a lot out of it.
It's a pleasure speaking to you again. Thanks for coming on.
Okay, no problem. See you.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.